I'm Sharon.
Thank you, Destiny. I'm really pleased to be with you today and talking about data. It's a hot topic right now for associations, and what I'm hoping to do with you today is create some context for you to understand how data can be used to transform your organization. So in the next 30 minutes, we're going to examine how data flows through an association to support decision making and to achieve your goals. We'll also look at the types of data used by association and kind of the basic concepts of data analytics. Finally, we'll talk about asking questions of your data and how they can shift your thinking to become a catalyst for change. We're going to, in essence, talk a little bit about commerce, we'll talk a little bit of IT, and spend quite a bit of time talking about how program managers can use data. So first, let's talk about how data flows through an association. And to do this, I'm going to use a supply chain concept. So I spent about 8 years plus at APICS, which is now the Association for Supply Chain Management. And probably like many of you, every association we serve, their body of knowledge kind of leaves a mark on us. And one of the things that I found really useful about supply chain is it's really a framework that will provide understanding of all sorts of different concepts. So in the manufacturing world where supply chain originates, it's a transformation process where value is created at every step in the journey to the end customer. So when we're talking about this from a manufacturing perspective, we talk about raw material moving through to suppliers, moving through to factories or manufacturers, and then on through the distribution centers and all the way to the customer. And from raw material to customer, value is added as that product, and usually it's a hard product, is created and moves through the flow of the supply chain. So if we apply that same concept to how data flows through the association supply chain, it would look something like this. The data comes in from various different sources. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we start with a certain base of association data, and this could be information about our members and our customers, financial information, it could be research. Often the data moves on through, especially when we're creating products, subject matter experts. So if you think about it, probably many of you are working on certifications or for a certifying body. The job task analysis would be an example of data. It moves to your group, your certification committee or board that's working on the certification, and they add value to that data. They analyze it and they look at it, and then they push it up to the association headquarters staff. And so if you're doing your exam writing in-house or you're working with psychometricians, you're going to turn around that data that from the job task analysis that went through the subject matter experts and turn that essentially into an exam. Now the exam is going to be distributed often directly by associations, but you might also use chapters or channel partners to provide some part of this service. And those channel partners and chapters are going to add data to the process. Associations, as people take exams, there's going to be data added to the process. Pass scores, sometimes with these certification exams, we're going to ask demographic questions. That's going to come into the process. If you're delivering directly and not through a channel partner, then you're delivering through maybe a website, and it could be your website or another website as well through a partner. And eventually that data becomes meaningful to members and professionals. In our example with certification, it could be their past scores, for example, or how they perform in the various domains of the certification examination. In other types of products, the data flows back from the member and is added to the association bank as well. So in the case of the pass scores, those will come back into the association, and then your certification staff is going to analyze whether your pass results, your percentage of pass examinations is hitting the mark that you're looking to make. And essentially, is the certification at the right level? Is it too easy? Is it too hard? So that's a concrete example of how data flows through associations. You probably can come up with a lot of your own examples when you really look at this, but the basic point that I'm trying to make here is essentially we start with some base raw data, and as that data flows through the association supply chain, value is added. We're understanding the data, we're adding to the data, it becomes more meaningful to us, and we're able to make business decisions based on that data. So there's all sorts of people that use data within the association. There's all sorts of decision-making flows. And so this is just a representative of what I would call a decision-making supply chain or a decision-making flow. And starting at the top of action, data flows from our customers in some ways all the way to our board at increasing levels of aggregation. So we get raw data in from our members. These could be transaction-based data. How many people are buying or using some of our products? And then staff will take that data and then staff adds meaning to that, to the data. So they look at the trends, they analyze what's going on, and they present this. So a lot of times you'd look at your finance staff here and they're watching the trends of participation or revenue, I guess as a reflection of participation, and passing that information on to management. So that could be managers or directors within your association. And when managers and directors are looking at that information, they're making some very immediate and practical decisions like, we're not seeing the kind of sales or participation we're looking for. We need to do something from a marketing perspective or a sales perspective that's going to ramp that up. Or it could say, yeah, well, look at this. We're really seeing a trend in the type of customer that is taking advantage of this program or services. Let's do more marketing to that customer because they're clearly well qualified to use this program. That information then gets aggregated up to the executive team typically, and they're going to put it together in a meaningful way so that the board can consume it. And so we see presentations. There's always a finance presentation, I believe, at board meetings. And the board is having to consume this information. It's possibly in the form of graphs or pages of kind of columns and rows of spreadsheets. But then the board is going to also critically evaluate the information that that data represents. So if we look down at impact, the board's going to ask these questions. How much did we spend on any particular program or service? How much did we do? What was the audience we reached? So for example, a lot of times we're looking at annual meetings and we're going, well, maybe we have 2,000 people show up at our annual meeting, but we've got 40,000 people in our membership base and maybe another, 40,000 that are customers. So what is the impact of the meeting vis-a-vis the number of people that are being impacted by it or attending it? So that gets us to that question of, well, how much did it matter? And the kinds of decisions we're looking at then in the case of the annual meeting is, what is the return on investment for the money that we're spending? How much did we spend? How much in the end did it really matter? How much did it advance our cause? So these are the kinds of questions that executives and boards are asking all the time. We're looking at the action that the data reflects, and then we're assessing the impact. And that's how we make good data-driven decisions. So it was interesting to me when I was putting the presentation together to think about data and what associations have access typically to. And some of you probably on the phone are like me and would maybe be able to go back to the 80s, not necessarily the 60s and 70s of, looking at association data. But I did put this information together, and I think it's kind of interesting as we look at it. So I know we've got the polling up here. I'm going to move that around a little. I hope that doesn't obstruct your view. We start in the 60s with mainframe computers, essentially, and we start collecting contact data. So how do we reach our customers? What are their names? Where are they located? What's their address? By the 70s, we were using our computers to also track transactional information. So we moved off of ledgers and into the mainframe environment as well. We know who's buying what products and when they're buying it. So that's kind of transactional data. In the 80s, especially with the advent of PC-based systems, we start doing demographic information more and more. Now, we might have had some demographic information for sure in the 70s, but what we see in the 80s that makes a big difference is PC-based database systems. So if you think way back, if you can, certainly FileMaker Pro would be an example, or Paradox, if you remember Paradox at all. And these were database systems that were accessible to non-technical people. So we could look at adding demographic fields, let's say, to our membership applications, which are still at this point primarily hard applications, hard paper applications that are being mailed in. But through data entry, we can get those, the demographic fields at least translated into a database, and we can start doing some analysis of that data. By the 90s, we started looking at what we call psychographic information. So psychographic information essentially is, what are our customers interested in? What are they valuing? And still, we're seeing this come primarily through surveys. In the 90s, we're able to email surveys, especially later in the 90s, we see that as being more common. And they show up as member needs assessments. So the type of questions that we're looking at here, maybe once a year or once every couple of years, we'll do a member need assessment, and we'll ask our members, what do you value? What are you interested in? What more should we be doing? And that information essentially becomes stale fairly quickly because it's based on a one and done survey. Attitudinal data, it tells us really how our customers feel and how they're likely to respond. So we can ask certainly our members in a member needs survey how they feel, but by the time we're moving into the 2000s, we're starting to collect this information more specifically as evaluations. So in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we really see a proliferation of evaluation on every product and services that the association is offering. And more, because we're now into the era of e-commerce, we're able to get reviews back on products and services that are fairly instant. And this data starts now, the combination of the psychographic and attitudinal data starts allowing us to create scenarios. So we can look at our customers' psychographic information, their attitudinal information, and maybe some of their demographic information as well, and start predicting or creating various scenarios on how our members and customers might respond. And then kind of the holy grail of data right now is behavioral data. So when we talk about behavioral data, we're talking about what our customers are actually doing. How are they engaging with us? How do we keep them engaged? We can also look at behavioral data vis-a-vis how the individual is interacting on the job. So behavioral data is very simple. It's just what are the behaviors of the individual that we're looking at that's a part of our base. And the really important thing about behaviors is that behaviors become very predictable. We can start to see trends and behaviors that really stand up. So if somebody buys one product, we're likely to be able to influence them to buy a similar product. So when we think about behavioral data, a good example of this, and it's also part transactional, so now we start getting a little blurry here between behavioral and transactional, is when you get an Amazon, you buy one product and they tell you, many customers who bought this product also brought this product. And you look at that and again, you're very susceptible. Well, if everybody else is doing it, maybe that's something I should really take a look at and consider as well. And in the case of Amazon, they do that essentially before you check out, so you can do that impulse buy. So what we're seeing from our poll here from the people that are responding is that you are collecting what we would expect, contact, transactional, and demographic data at the highest levels. It's a little bit interesting that that everybody's not collecting contact data, so that seems a little bit odd to me. But I'm not at all surprised about the three levels of data at the top. Attitudinal and behavioral data, I think, is excellent. These are really good results, I believe. It's not everybody that's collecting this information, but an awful lot of you are doing web analytics, for example, and web analytics, a lot of web analytics are also marking behavioral data. So you may be collecting behavioral data and not really sure about the fact that you really are. Okay, we can close that poll. Can I close that poll? I can. All right. And you know what, Destiny? It's not letting me. Let's try this. There we go. So as we look at the type of data, this kind of continuum of data that associations are collecting and how that's moved out historically, it has a very close correlation to IT infrastructure. So when we think about when associations started investing in technology and actual IT infrastructure, for many associations, this might have been in the 70s. I can't even quite go back to the 70s of my own knowledge, but I feel like from a timing perspective, we're going to see this in the 70s primarily. And we're looking at mainframe computers or mini computers and terminals. A lot of people had the AS400, that was an IBM. They might have had Wang, they might have had Data General. And these were pre-programmed terminals, so you had to decide, I mean, pre-programmed computers, applications, you had to decide what information you were going to collect. You couldn't make change to this very easily. We did have association management systems back in the day in the 70s and certainly into the 80s, where the mainframes and mini computers were still very popular. But those association management systems were pretty rigid in terms of the amount of data that they could collect for making change to that. And then in the 80s, later in the 80s, and certainly in the 90s, we moved to this PC client server, Ethernet networks, platform, and this gave us a whole lot more flexibility than we had before collecting data, as I mentioned, because of those PC databases. So not only did association management systems become easier to customize than those micros and minis, the minis and the mainframes, but also we could do paper surveys, get the surveys, the hard copies back, and do data entry into PC databases. So this gave us a greater ability to manipulate the data. But it was still fairly manual to collect that data. It was going in through data entry departments. The third platform that we're seeing here of associations is the cloud platform. So the transition that associations are making today, especially if they're if they have the flexibility to move off of one and totally into the cloud, they might do that all at one time, or they might do it piece by piece or application by application. But the great thing about cloud applications is it gives us a tremendous amount of flexibility. So we can add all sorts of different applications that collect data for us, and we can integrate those applications more easily than we were able before. We're able to communicate with our members so that they are entering the data themselves, and we don't have to worry about the data entry side of this. We find all sorts of ways to coax our members to tell us about themselves, and obviously we can do that through mobile apps and our website, and then we're able to take and look at that data. E-commerce was the kind of mecca of transactional data. So we didn't leave transactional data behind. In fact, transactional data is the basis typically of big data. How are our members and our customers interacting with us, and they're giving us data and potentially don't really even understand that they're giving us data by essentially looking at web pages or downloading documents and the like. So we're in that third platform right now. And the biggest, I think, benefit when we talk about data of the third platform is the availability of the data, the accessibility of the data, and the ability of non-technical or staff that haven't been trained in analytics to actually use that data. So data drives associations in a whole lot of different ways in businesses, and you can see across here we can increase revenue, reduce expenses, and actually create new business models using data. So if you look at increased revenue, probably you're all familiar with how we do this. We look at our pricing models, and we're able to create pricing models that give us a sense of how the market will react to a price increase and predict revenue and that basis, and be able to implement pricing that is going to make the biggest impact on our revenue. We certainly can look at improving retention through the use of data, cross-selling and upselling when we have our products kind of mapped so that we can see similarities across these lines and the customers that are most likely to buy across the lines. Marketing promotion and segmentation, marketing automation obviously is a big generator of data and user of data. And then of course, personalization. So when we really understand what our members and our customers need, we can create personalized content for them. And we can actually automate that personalization in a way that we never could before. So we talked about one-to-one marketing in the 90s. I remember doing a presentation on it at the time, but we really didn't have the technology accessible to make that real. Today we can mass customize and we can personalize because the technology, this cloud-based technology, gives us a lot of power. In terms of reducing expenses, we certainly have data that tells us how we can optimize our resources, and we can look at product lifecycle analysis and make decisions based on the usage data of those products to understand when it's time to sunset the product, where they're really not paying for us and paying anymore, and what we can do to create products that we can get maximum revenue from. We're also becoming more performance focused with this data, so we see now the proliferation of KPIs that we can measure and help us understand where we need to reduce expenses. And then creating new business models, certainly using data to create new membership models. Right now we're seeing that all over the place, deciding on international expansion and whether we want and can do business in other countries, monetizing data, so all this data we collect and where we have access to, how do we make that work for us? And ultimately that rolls into creating data platform business models. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is that most associations are still overwhelmingly working off a physical model. They may digitally deliver products, but those digitally delivered products have more in common with physical products. So they're fairly static, they're produced, and they then are distributed, than these data platform business models, which I think is the future of associations and offers a key to survivability in a lot of ways. So when we think about data platform businesses, we're talking about Facebook and Amazon and Google as well. So associations that understand the transformative power of data here are creating all sorts of processes and structures to leverage it. And so essentially, when we're using data to make decisions, we get the data we need, we explore that data, make sure we really understand it, we start modeling it. That's where we see the beginning of our scenario planning, visualizing the results. So if we make this choice, what would it look like versus that choice? We create those models. Scenario planning simulates results, so it looks at kind of the upside and the downside of various scenarios. And again, we then make a decision based on that modeling. And the goal, obviously, is to drive member or customer value through that process. But no matter how sophisticated your analytic capability, the most important indication of future success of an organization is its ability to ask good questions. So all of that I just rolled through, especially that last slide, if it feels complicated to you or you think you don't have the resources to be able to do those steps, what I'm going to say is that you do, but what happens, your guide through that process is your ability to ask really powerful questions and sequence those questions across that transformation process. So this is a common quote from Albert Einstein. We see this a lot, but he essentially says, if I had a problem to solve, basically and my life depended on the solution of that, I'd spend the 55 minutes of that hour trying to figure out what the right question to ask is. Because if I ask the right question, I'm going to have a solution. And I think that that's really important. We often skip that questioning phase. We jump to trying to find solutions, but through the questioning, through creating these questions or sequence of questions, we actually start really understanding the problem, and asking the right question is key to getting the right data. There's a book I'll just mention very quickly called A More Beautiful Question, and this book was really eye-opening for me because it gives so much practical advice and lots of case studies about how businesses that broke the mold, let's say, they do go through quite a long example of Netflix in here, which is really good, and it's a commonly used example, but they really show how Netflix continues to advance its business model by asking the right question. So questions can be a catalyst for change. So applying this to associations, let's take a look at some potentially beautiful questions that you might be asking already. So what if we could interact with each one of our members and customers as a unique individual? What if we could provide ongoing, specific, and personalized support to our members to advance their careers or their businesses and achieve their goals? What if we were able to engage our members and customers in the co-creation of content that advances the profession or the industry? So all of these questions are somewhat related to membership retention. But notice we didn't ask the question, how do we improve member retention? Because when we ask that question, how, first of all, do we improve member retention? We go right to trying to get the answer. Well, we could do this or we could do this. But by stopping and exploring these what if questions, and what if is a sign of a beautiful question, according to Berger, what if we could interact with each of our members and customers as if they were unique individuals? What would have to be true? If this was true, what would also have to be true? So data and analytics turn these beautiful questions into something that's really actionable. So if we take this question, what if we could provide ongoing, specific, personalized programs and support to our members to advance their careers and achieve their goals? Then we go to the next question, what else would have to be true? Well, we would have to gain an intimate knowledge of our members so that we could discern and provide what they need, right? So we'd have to anticipate their needs. And we put that in the form of a question. How do we? How do we use that information to create just-in-time micro programs delivered to them in the format that they prefer? Obviously, we have to have a lot of data there that would tell us that. How do we engage our community to respond to the needs of others so that our association is the professional or industry platform that advances everyone? So this is a layer down in these beautiful questions. And when we get to these how questions, then we start to look at data questions. So business analytics turns beautiful questions into something actionable by posing and answering business questions from data we have or data we might have to require. So again, if you can start with that what if question, what if we could provide an ongoing, specific, personalized program and support our members to advance their careers and achieve their goals? That's the beautiful question. The business question is, how do we gain that intimate knowledge of our members so that we can discern and provide them what they need? Then the data questions are, what data do we currently have available to us? What data will we need to acquire? How can we acquire that data? And do we have the tools that we need to harness and leverage that data? So we've got a quick poll here. And the question we're asking here is, how proactive is your organization in acquiring data it needs to advance? Okay, and as we look at this, what we see is that we've got the majority here, it looks like, saying somewhat proactive, we make the most of the data. Whoops, there we go. Somewhat proactive, we make the most of the data to which we currently have access. So I think that is not necessarily surprising. I think we all try to use what we have as much as we can, but I think one of our gaps is that we don't think about how do we get data from the outside, and especially if your association is on that third tier platform, if you're in the cloud, integrating with another platform of data, either accessing data from a source. There's a healthcare, I'm going to just name one called Definitive Healthcare, where they have data about hospital and health systems, and you can integrate that data into your system to be able to supplement the data that you need. But it's not surprising necessarily that the majority of associations are just making the most of what they have. So this table I often find helpful when I'm trying to decide what data we're going to need to get when we're developing a business strategy. So if somebody had said to me, you know, I need to develop a strategy to improve member retention, I'm going to start with that beautiful question. What would we need to provide ongoing, specific, and personalized programs and support for our members to advance their careers and their goals? Because if we do that, we're going to improve retention. And so you can see here we've drilled down and in a kind of a structured way thought about the different type of data that we would need. And when you look across this to data source, certainly there's some data that we already have in our association management systems. There are also ways that we could launch even products like assessment products that would provide an ongoing stream of data to us. So when we think about digital platform business models, a lot of those digital platform business models, the associations that are doing them, and there aren't very many associations doing this right now, they have a data source that's continuous, and it might be an assessment. So you might look at there's quite a few associations that do assessments, and those assessments might be competency-based assessments or other types of behavioral-based assessments. And then they can look at that information. And I think the most common use for it is that they'll mark it off of it. So if you self-assess, you know, at a higher level or a lower level, you'll get different marketing messages. But if that self-assessment is able, you know, to be something that is taken year over year, you can continue to watch not only the development of your professionals, but you start to understand what's really important to them and what are the important products that you should be offering to help them advance. Then we also have this third category of data that's coming from outside of the association. Well, web analytics aren't necessarily, but we can run focus groups, and more we're coding focus group or text-based data to be able to use. So you can, this is not a difficult skill. You essentially take comment data, and this could even be comment data from evaluations, and you code it, and then it becomes something that you can search and you can use in all sorts of different ways throughout the year, and certainly environmental scans. And then I mentioned before, there's also that possibility of bringing data into your system. A number of associations are looking at data warehouses right now, and again, old concept, but all of a sudden with cloud technology and that third platform, we're able to implement them at relatively low cost. So there's a number of association data and analytic service providers that can offer even small associations data analytics services and data warehouses or data lakes for relatively low amounts of money, especially when you look at the return on that investment. So that is 30 minutes on the transformative power of data. It's a really quick take at what we're looking at here. And one of the things that I wanted to mention to you is that orgSource does offer a data transformation workshop. It's aimed at program managers. There's really nobody in an association that couldn't benefit from this content or the content is above. So it's not IT oriented, but spends a lot of time at looking at the type of questions that you would need to ask, and that's a really distinctive skill. And then being able to discern what type of data you need to be able to answer those questions. In some of those workshops, we actually run a case study. So we ask the association ahead of time, what is a big problem that you're trying to address right now, and then run it like a case competition where we have groups of staff using some skills that we've given them about using data for transformation. We actually give them some data to work with and have them have like a little competition in terms of coming up with a solution to the problem or the question. If that's something that you're interested in, based on this taste of using data to transform your organization, you can contact me directly, and I'd be glad to help you. Here's my contact information. You can certainly talk to Kevin or Sherry or Destiny about this as well. But we're really excited to be able to continue to work with associations to harness the power of data to advance their organizations. Destiny, how are we doing on time?
We have time for a couple of questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat bar, or you can use the Q&A feature. Just real fast, Sharon, I have a question. What are the ways an association can create a more steady stream of behavioral data when they have a limited number of ways for members to interact with them?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. One of the things that we're seeing when we talk about personalized products and services, we're seeing in organizations that are, again, on that third platform, so they're moving towards that digital transformation business model. They're working in the cloud, and as they're creating these personalized products, we're seeing product proliferation. And it might be a base product that, as we said, has been personalized to the member. And so there are ways to increase the number of interactions that you're having with the member based on that scenario where we're getting this proliferation of personalized product that using and leveraging a base. But when I think about how do we keep a steady stream of data coming into the association, you want to look for developing programs that are not one and done. So if I buy a product, it's a one and done. And yes, I have the transactional information from that. But if I serve up that product to my member in a way that's more interactive, then they're going to keep coming back and they're going to keep using that product. And we can set that up from a technology perspective so you're watching them as they use that product and you're understanding. And this could be as simple as, let's say you have a reference type of a book, a body of knowledge, let's say. And instead of giving them a hard copy of that body of knowledge, you give them an interactive copy of it. So something, let's switch to dictionary. So when I'm looking up terms in a dictionary, I can start to see the kinds of things every time they come back to look at that term, what they're interested in and what they're looking at and what they're accessing. So when we create products now, going forward, we have to think about how can we extract data from the usage of that product. Otherwise, as I said before, assessments are a great way to get people to kind of give you data and get something back in return.
Thank you, Sharon. And just one last question here, unless it doesn't look like we have any typed in the chat bar, but can we make advancements with data-driven decision-making without analytics function on staff?
So I think the question is, as I'm understanding it, is essentially, if I don't have that IT department that has an analytics component, or sometimes we see analytics in other departments as well, can we really advance in this area? And I'd say absolutely. Just like back in the 80s when people were learning to use Paradox so that they could do these basic database functions or do some analytics, just as people have become extremely sophisticated, I think, in using Excel to perform analytic functions, we have tools that are accessible to everybody. And I do think the interesting thing about data is all the data in the world is not going to help you unless you can focus on the answer that you're trying to get. So that where we come back to the question is, what is the right question to ask of the data? If you can ask the right question of the data, there's a way to get, extract the data that you need to be able to answer that question. So just like Einstein is saying, I'd spend 55 minutes trying to figure out what the question is, because that gives you focus. You know what you're going after, and then you're surprised, I think, as you pursue that, all the different data sources potentially that you can get that's going to add understanding and add to your ability to answer that question and advance the organization.